Well, now that the election is over, you might think your family gatherings will be safe again, free from bitter arguments, unless you listen to our next guest. He begins his latest project with this quote: "This is a book designed to start arguments." Author and music journalist Gary Graff's new book is 501 Essential Albums of the 90s, the music fan's definitive guide. Is it really definitive, Gary? Because I find one of my favorites did not even make it into the book. I don't want to start this interview with an argument, though, so I'll share my missing.
I'm ready for it.
Okay, well, I'll share my missing preference later. Let's start with why you're a definitive favorite when it comes to music journalist. Your background, you lived the last 40 years in Detroit, which we know is home to so many great musicians and music. Motown, Bob Seger, techno actually originated there. Hip hop, gospel singer Aretha Franklin. Your older hippie brother used to bring home albums.
He did, and that's really how I got into music. I was 7 years old, and my favorite song was Steppenwolf's "Born to Be Wild." Everybody else, it was whatever was on Saturday morning cartoons or the Disney movie.
Yeah.
And I was a little headbanger when there was hair to bang on your head.
You wrote for the elementary school newspaper, and your parents thought the dream of a nice Jewish boy becoming a doctor is now over.
Yeah, that was it. That was it. They were very supportive in all this. And when I got to, thank you for that quick impersonation. So when I got to take my parents to see Barbra Streisand when she began touring again, it all made sense to them.
Yeah, you absolutely love it. Graduated college, you covered the music beat at a newspaper, and then you published your first book in 1996. You are an award-winning journalist, and it shows how much you put into it. And with so much music out there, there's a lot to do.
Oh, there's a ton. There was a study that was recently done that showed more music was released in one day in 2024 than the entire decade of the 90s.
Wow. All right.
So
music has power, as we know. Songs and lyrics have that power. Marvin Gaye, "What's Going On?" There were songs that really defined an era or defined a cause. USA for Africa, "We Are the World," all those types of things. You've interviewed so many artists one-on-one. You've seen 200 concerts a year. As I mentioned, award-winning, Emmy-winning co-founder and producer of Detroit Music Awards and a regular Billboard contributor. You've done so many great music bios as well, where we get to hear the heart behind songs and what was going on during the times. Neil Young, Rock and Roll Myths, Traveling Man with Bob Seger, all of those types of things. All right, Alice Cooper. In fact, you were on recently about that one, which was amazing. What was the inspiration for the new book?
Basically, it came from discussions with the publisher. This is the fourth or fifth book I've done with this publisher, and we had an idea to let's do some sort of essential best of albums guide series, and why not do it by decades? So we started with the 90s. We've got the 80s already done and coming out with May. And then, we'll see if we go forward or backwards from there.
Yeah, because we got to do some 70s, so you call me on that one. But
Absolutely.
When you talk about the 90s, there's specific things with each decade, and that was the last golden age of that thing called the album.
It really was. It was when we consumed music by the album. The Billboard #1 album, any given week in the 90s, sold 500,000 copies, 800,000 copies, 1 million copies. Now you're lucky if it sells 30,000 copies in its first week out. And just the dialogue about music was about albums, the hits, the deep cuts, and that's really how we focused it in. So it was a good decade really to start the series with.
Yeah, if you were from a certain generation, you would have spent your lawn cutting money, babysitting money, or your allowance on an album. What was the first one you bought with intention on your own?
Well, on my own, that's a great question, because that was a long time ago. It was probably a Steppenwolf album, actually. I mentioned "Born to Be Wild" earlier, and at that time I was becoming very music conscious and savvy. They had a couple of key albums out, so I'm thinking that's what it is. I have to separate them from what I stole from my brother's collection and didn't actually buy.
Yeah. My babysitting money went to the Jackson Five and the Osmond Brothers. All right,
Okay.
and that was a long time ago, as you said. Your new book,
Not as long as what I just said.
You're right. Your new book, 501 Essential Albums of the 1990s, 448 pages, over 600 images, year by year organization. You really put a lot of thought into how it's laid out and the stories behind all of it. If we have this book, we can be the most hip person at the cocktail parties. There's notable singles, influence on other artists as well. All right. I love when you start out with, this is a book that's designed to cause arguments.
It is. No, it is. And anytime you're talking about anything like this, people have their own tastes, they have their own judgments. It was interesting because I have about 3 dozen other writers, friends and colleagues, who I'm pleased to say are still friends and colleagues after they saw how I edited their entries. But the discussions we had in coming up with the list, 501 sounds like a big number. But then when you make a long list of 2,300
Wow.
and you have to whittle it down to 501, and there were a lot of, and I use the term discussions lightly. They were passionate discussions. Some might call them arguments. We had many of the writers and I cover concerts here on a regular basis. And we'd all be at the same concert, and between the acts, we'd be talking about the book and what's going to be in the book. And the people around us were calling security, thinking we were going to start throwing punches at each other.
But that shows you how passionate people are about music. They're fighting for their song, fighting for the band, even though they've never met them.
Exactly. No, but you've heard them, and that connection you make to a song or an album is deep.
Yeah.
As anybody knows, you live with that, and it's part of your life. And the 90s, because it was that last golden age of the album, we were still making that connection and living. That music was part of our lives and our souls. And those artists, the bands, the groups, the solo artists, they were very important people to us. They were in our life. So of course you carry that into a project like this, where you're going to fight for and look for the artists you care about and the albums you care about.
Yeah, because you're talking about bringing that music into your home that you connected to, and if you were stuck in rush hour traffic in a major city, you were even more connected to that song. All right,
very much so, because we listened to radio back then,
right?
Too.
Right,
terrestrial radio.
I always ask artists from back in the day, it's like, where were you the very first time you actually heard your song on the radio? And oftentimes they say, if cassette tapes were out, they're like, I got ready to play the cassette tape again and realized it wasn't the cassette. It was actually on the radio, and other people were hearing it too.
That's great.
Some obvious choices include Nirvana, Nevermind, Snoop Doggy Dogg, so MC Hammer. So you certainly have a wide variety there.
Yeah, we went for the whole panoply of music. It was funny towards the end of the project, the publisher said to me, maybe we should have made this the 501 Essential Rock Albums. And I'm like, now you're telling me.
Yeah, right.
But no, I'm glad we did it this way. I'm glad we have gospel in here, and we have electronic music, and we have R&B, rap, pop, rock, metal.
Country. You got George Strait, Garth Brooks. You have Whitney Houston.
Country.
Yeah.
The 90s was a huge decade for country.
It was, because country kind of changed, and country could sound gospel. It could sound pop as well.
Country became rock and roll.
Yeah,
in the 90s.
Exactly. And of course, Whitney Houston, the Bodyguard soundtrack. So especially when you started connecting songs to movies, that even gave it much more popularity.
Yeah, it was something that, kind of started in the 70s, but kept accelerating. And by the time we were in the 90s, the movie soundtrack, was as dependable to deliver a hit as an album by an individual artist or act.
Yeah, sometimes the music hit was bigger than the movie itself. All right.
Oh, yeah.
One-hit wonders on amazing albums, Counting Crows, Hanson, The Wallflowers.
Yeah, I don't call those one-hit wonders. They're defined by one or two hits, but they have sustained careers. They're still out there actively touring, actively making new music. They were able to, with some of the albums you're showing now, the debut albums, they were able to establish a career that they were able to sustain. And this is an eternal argument in music. It's like, okay, yeah, they had that big hit and or that big hit album, but they're still viable even if people aren't buying the music in the numbers they used to.
Yeah. And you never know when it's going to become popular again. Just look at the YMCA right now. All right.
Well, yeah, that's a whole driven by a whole different thing. But yeah, no, artists do come in, in and out, and every now and then you hit the zeitgeist, or you get a song in a soundtrack, and suddenly you're popular again. All those, or you collaborate with somebody. You sing with Taylor Swift, and you're suddenly back in the public consciousness.
Yeah, is it Guardians of the Galaxy that had House of the Rising Sun? And my son was like, "Have you heard this song, Mom?" I was like, "Way before you were born." In fact, I was barely born. All right.
Yeah, Rubber Band Man.
Yep. Some interesting additions: Los Super 7, Arthur Alexander, and Chris Whitley. But there are also some things that are conspicuous by their absence. So, give me the reason to want you back on this show when I did not see Luther Vandross.
Luther. Okay, so you'll see Luther in the '80s.
There you go. Yeah.
There are a number of artists not in here, significant artists not in here. Luther, Jackson Browne, James Taylor. There are a number of them, and when we really came down to making the list, even though they produced some fine albums during the '90s, they weren't albums that were essential to their own catalogs, much less to the decade. So we really had to make some hard choices there, but that essential word is really what drove us. It had to be an essential, must listen to album that really helped define what the decade was.
And in all fairness,
and then, like I say, come '80s, you're gonna find a lot of those people.
Yeah, yeah. And in all fairness, when I look back at it, I was like, "Where's Luther?" And then I realized, wait a minute. And Luther had such a long career. He started in the '70s, right? And then so I was like, okay, the '80s was the crux of when he put out a lot of those songs that we know him for. So you are forgiven. You are forgiven, and I look forward to that
Thank
'80s.
You. You'll have me back for the '80s.
I will have you back because you're so amazing, so amazing. All right. So with this book, what I love about it, and what I love about you, is that you really take music out of simply entertainment, and you help us to understand how critical it is in society and in cultures.
Yeah, you take that for granted sometimes, but think about how much time you spend just humming something.
Yeah.
Sitting at your desk at work or something, humming something, and music is even more all around us than it ever was. Like I said at the beginning, 2024, more music was released in one day than in the entire decade of the '90s. That's crazy.
Yeah, and of course, there's more ways to do it today. With social media and the whole bit. Gary, thank you so much for joining us this morning, and thank you for these books. Keep them coming. I know we got the '80s, the '70s is right behind it.
We will, and thank you very much for having me.
All right. Gary Graff's latest book, 501 Essential Albums of the '90s, The Music Fan's Definitive Guide, is available now everywhere books are sold, including the trunk of Gary's car. For more details on Gary's various projects, visit greatdayhouston.com, and we will connect you.